everyone, and welcome back to the Bovine. I'm your host, Kara Mastel. How it is already fall is beyond my understanding. I mean, I swear each year time just continues to go faster and faster. I was thinking of seasons the other day. I know there's a lot of people that say I'm a fall or I'm a spring person, and it got me thinking about what my favorite season is. I used to, without a doubt, say fall. I love wearing, long sleeve shirts and vests and jeans, and it's so great. I'm not a big hot weather person, so 15 degrees, that is my prime. But then I got to thinking that maybe it is spring. Everything's coming alive for a new year, and it seems to be the great annual reset. You aren't tired of pulling weeds yet. Cutting the grass is still exciting. You haven't regretted the size of the garden you planted, which I often do in August every year. Calves are being born, and, we're remembering the beauty of life. You get the picture I'm painting here. But then, and sorry, I know I'm really going down a rabbit hole here, I got to thinking, I really am just a season person. I wouldn't want it to be any season all year, and I'm grateful to live in a province that gets to experience all 4 seasons. As much as I don't always like to admit it, change can be good, and the seasons are not immune to that either. So if you have any thoughts on that, don't hesitate to email me, karam@albertabeef.org, or if you're listening on Spotify, simply click the text us option in the podcast description. We love hearing from you, so keep it coming. Back to the real reason you're here, the podcast. Today on the Bovine, we're talking about sustainability, and please do not run at the word sustainability. This is a great conversation. I hope you stick around for it. Public Stakeholder Engagement, which is a program under the Canadian Cattle Association, conducted a research survey back in July 2023 on the different pillars of sustainability and how we can look at the definition as a whole concept of things. Joining me today to talk about the sustainability assessment is Jenna Sarich, who is the Stakeholder Engagement Technical Consultant for the Canadian Cattle Association, specifically focusing on public stakeholder engagement, which will likely be referred to from here on out as PSE. Jenna, before we get too into the weeds here, to make sure we're all on the same page, what is PSE?
So Public and Stakeholder Engagement, we are funded from National Checkoff, and we're delivered jointly through Canada Beef, and that's 25% through Canada Beef, and then also 75% through the Canadian Cattle Association. And the main objective of Public and Stakeholder Engagement is to deal with concerns from the public about beef production in Canada, and then we're also working to increase public trust of how we raise cattle in Canada. So we create a lot of different resources and that type of thing that can be implemented to help those efforts. The work that PSE does, it's kind of divided into 4 different buckets. So we have our proactive projects, and that's looking at that suite of short documentaries. And then we deal with issues management. So if we have articles come out that are talking about beef and the environment, for example, we have some data, and we'll write back to some of those articles using some published data and information that we have. We also create producer resources like flip books and fact sheets, and then we also do consumer research. So this really gives us a good indication of how consumers are, what they're looking for, what they're concerned about, what they're really happy with, and maybe what they want to learn more about. So we did a full research survey back in 2023 in July, and we were trying to get a good perspective of how Canadians are feeling. So we found that 94% of Canadians are wanting to know more about where their food comes from. So they're really interested in it, but they just have limited knowledge. And there's so much information out there, it's hard for people to know what to listen to. And then we also saw that consumers really do love beef. We saw 90% of them love the taste, 89% think of it as a high quality food, and 84% say that it's healthy. And then when we dive a little deeper into how beef producers are raising cattle and looking a bit more into environmental practices, we see that less consumers are feeling as confident specifically about the environmental practices on farms. So this is looking at things like being good stewards of the land and water, making a sincere effort to limit the environmental impact of their work. So this is where the National Beef Sustainability Assessment really comes in. We're able to have these really robust, published, scientifically backed numbers that we can implement into a lot of these resources to show look, there's this great environmental story of raising beef production in Canada. And we did retest this question this year in 2024, and we did see an 8% increase in the last year with an increased perception of beef farmers and their impact on the environment.
So, when you're talking about environmental, are you talking from the perspective of a producer or how the consumer sees how livestock is raised?
It's how the consumer sees it. So the questions more specifically are asking, do you see Canadian beef farmers and ranchers being good stewards of the land and water? Do you see them making a sincere effort to limit the environmental impact of their work? And we kind of got a 50-50 response of people feeling excellent and good, and the other not exactly feeling negative, but just feeling unsure. They really don't know. They're not on farm. They don't know what the practices look like. So a lot of them are kind of just sitting in that middle ground. And those are the people that if we present them some of our information, they're able to come on to that other side of things and look at it a little bit more favorably.
Now, when looking at some of the environmental livestock indicators, you guys took an ESLA approach. Do you want to elaborate on what that actually means?
Yeah, so when we're looking at the environmental indicators that go into beef production, we wanted to make sure that we're using the most robust and an international method to ensure that the results we're getting out of it are robust and they're as rigorous as possible so that they have a lot of backing to them. So we used an environmental life cycle assessment, and that's a tool that's used to assess the environmental performance of products, of processes, of services. And it's used by many different industries, and it's widely recognized within the research industry or the research community. So it provides us a comprehensive approach to understanding the relationships, the trade-offs between environmental impacts of producing a product, in this case being beef.
And now you mentioned that these are all measured and put into an actual Canadian journal. What journal does it go into?
Yeah, so we did this assessment. We did our environmental life cycle assessment, and this is part of our National Beef Sustainability Assessment. And then we wanted to go one step further. This being our second one to date, we wanted to put a little bit more rigor behind it. And we had some researchers from the University of Manitoba, along with some scientists from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, to take that data and write an article and submit it to the Canadian Journal of Animal Science. So it was successfully published within that academic journal just in January of this year.
Now, another thing I know you guys have looked at is land use assessment. What was found there? What do you look at?
Yeah, this is really important because the ELCA that I mentioned earlier, that's looking at the environmental indicators that go into producing beef. So we're kind of looking at the resources that are being used, the carbon that's being emitted, potential water and air pollution. But there's also this other side of the environmental coin, and it's really important to talk about both things because we can't really just narrow and look at one thing without looking at the trade-offs or the benefits in another area. So when we're looking at the environment, we need to look into the benefits that having beef cattle on the land, grazing pastures and grasslands in Canada provide. So this is looking at things like the biodiversity and the wildlife that are living on those areas that cattle share that ecosystem with. And then also looking at that soil organic carbon within the roots of that grass that is largely due to having cattle and having those grazing behaviors on that land.
Any surprises when you guys actually dove into some of this land use stuff?
We saw some really positive results when we were looking at the land use indicators. When we're looking at land use specifically, we see that beef production is using 40% of Canada's agricultural land. And when we're looking at that 40%, we see that 84% of that is pasture. So the majority of the land beef cattle are using in Canada is pasture, and that pasture land is extremely critical for that soil carbon and that biodiversity that we were talking about. And one of the really big surprises, but something that we kind of knew was coming, is the amount of carbon that was stored within that land. So we saw that there was 1.9 billion tons of carbon being stored in the land that beef cattle are using. Wow. And to put that into some type of context, that would be equivalent to taking 2 billion passenger vehicles off the road for an entire year. And that's how much carbon that we're keeping in that grass by grazing on it and keeping that in pasture.
Let's switch, I guess, then on that topic and go into this social assessment. You talked a bit earlier about some of the outlooks towards the beef industry, but where are we at? Where are we doing really well, and where could we have some improvements?
Yeah, I mean, the beef industry, just like any other industry, there's different aspects of it. And the social assessment really wanted to look at the processes and practices that go into producing beef and demonstrating the areas we're doing really well and identify areas that we could improve. So our researchers in this area, they kind of did a scoping phase, see what are the issues, what are the things we want to focus on. They then did a practice-based assessment, and then they decided to do 4 different deep dives. And the deep dives that we really wanted to focus on for the social assessment was labor management. So this is looking at working conditions throughout the supply chain. We also wanted to look at people's health and safety. We also included animal care and antimicrobial use. So some of the results that we saw in regard to this, when we're looking at labor management, and this is not only in the beef industry, but looking kind of at the agricultural industry in general, there's a lot of jobs that are created through these industries and through the beef industry, but there's just not enough people to fill them. So we are seeing a growing labor gap within this area. We have a lot of jobs on farm that need to be filled, and it's just hard to find that work in these rural areas. But we do see that there's policies and there's programs in place that are working to support some of these affected stakeholders and to help mitigate some of these challenges that would help alleviate some of the risks that go into having that low amount of labor availability and recruitment. Then when we're looking at people's health and safety, we see that there's a lot more awareness and preparation for on-farm health and safety. And we do see that there is a focus on training and a larger focus on access to proper safety equipment. And those things are going to be really beneficial to protect people's health and safety across the sector. And then when we're looking at animal care, this was a really successful story in Canada. We have a high level of animal care, but we do see areas for improvement. And this includes things like increasing practice adoption, increasing some coordination and communication across all the businesses, sectors, and industries, just to ensure that the animal care is upheld throughout the cattle's entire life cycle. And then we also looked at antimicrobial use. So this is finding here, there's a large range of perceptions in regards to antimicrobial use within the industry. But we do see that increasing some of the management practices associated with antimicrobial use, so reducing some stressors on the cattle and increasing access to veterinarians, which is a large gap as well, especially in some of the rural areas and some of the western provinces, would help to increase that performance within the antimicrobial use area.
On the labor management side, like I know I've had this conversation with many people before where we talk about, how do we actually fill these gaps? How are we as an industry encouraging people to come out and, that get rid of that mentality that you have to grow up on a farm to be a part of agriculture?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge thing, and there's some companies and some of our members that are working on things like this. And I think a large part of it is making agriculture and working on farm to be an attractive job for anyone. And I think there is a large maybe stigma that you do need to be kind of born into it in order to kind of continue down that path. So I think with social media and things like that nowadays, there's a lot of tools that we can work to increase some of the work, the labor coming into that area, but there's definitely more work to be done as well.
So we've touched on the social assessment, the environmental side. Of course, we still need to make a living, so you got to follow the money. What about the economic assessment? He looked at a few different indicators there. Do you want to kind of elaborate on what those indicators are?
Yeah, for sure. So looking at the economic assessment, and our economic sustainability is really defined as the ability of the system to maintain productivity in the face of major disturbance. So this is looking at things like shifts in consumer preferences, changes in market conditions, and just being able to adapt to these things as they come up. So when we were doing the social or the economic assessment, we looked at it through two different lenses. So we're looking at it from producer viability. Our producer is able to make money. And then we're also looking at it from a consumer resilience and demand perspective as well. So are people eating beef out there? And if prices increase or other factors come in, are they going to come back and keep eating beef? So we use four indicators as benchmarks, and this included long-term profitability. So over a long period of time, our producer is going to be able to make money off of this. We also looked at long-term per unit cost of production. So for every animal they're selling or for every kilogram of beef that's being produced, what's that cost of production? And then we also looked at the consumer demands here at home in Canada, so looking at it domestically, and then we're also looking at it on an international level as well.
So why is it important when doing a sustainability assessment like this to look at the whole picture? You know, I think sometimes when we look at sustainability, we can kind of pigeonhole ourselves into the environmental side of it. Why did you guys see it as crucial to look at the whole picture?
Yes, absolutely. I find a lot of times sustainability is a synonym for environment. And I think we do really need to kind of push and really talk about the true definition of sustainability, which is really looking at economic, environmental, and social lenses. I've seen it referred to before as a stool, a three-legged stool. And if you don't have one leg, the stool is not going to work. So if something is environmentally sustainable and it's making money, but producers, it's such a high amount of labor or requirements or reporting that goes into it, it's not going to work. It's not going to be sustainable. And same the other way, if something is good for the environment and it's applicable in terms of a social situation, but it's not making producers any money, it's never going to work. So ensuring that those three legs are always standing together, that's the definition, and making sure that that's the definition of sustainability, is kind of looking at that homeostasis between those three aspects.
I love that because I think you're absolutely right that we correlate sustainability with environmentalism, and yes, it is a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole puzzle. So definitely love that
Mhm.
message. Now we have all this information and great information, but the next step is to do. I mean, this is we talk about this all the time in agriculture. You collect data, but now you do something with the data. Talk about how you guys are working with the results.
Yeah, this is probably one of the biggest hurdles in beef industry and in agriculture in general is people are moving away from the farm. They don't see it. They might see animals in a truck on the highway or cattle grazing, but they don't know what goes into producing food. And there's just this large gap between what's happening on farm and what's on your plate. So telling that story from the farm and getting it to the people that are in the city and to make them think about it and to make them kind of care about it, that's a huge, it's a huge thing that we need to work on. And public and stakeholder engagement, they've been doing a lot of different projects, looking at it from a couple different lenses to try to bridge this gap. So there's things that we've created. We are putting out a suite of short documentaries. One of the questions in our consumer research is how do you want to get this information? What's a way, people likely aren't going to go into Google and research things and read scientific papers themselves. They want it in, an easier, digestible way. So how do you want to see this information? And a lot of people, the majority of people really like watching documentaries. And we do see this, we see documentaries come on Netflix and we see a lot of uptake of them. And we wanted to be able to create some proactive content in that form of documentaries. So we released our first one, which was called Guardians of the Grasslands. And I think most people would be familiar with this one. We released this back in 2019, and this is really focusing on the the purpose of having cattle on the land and how they contribute to the ecosystem and healthy wildlife and flourishing grass, and looking at that carbon potential when cattle are grazing on the grasslands. And then we've also created some other short documentaries, which take a little bit of a different lens and some different messaging, some that people might not think much about. And one of those being Too Close to Home is what the documentary is called. And that's focusing on a pilot project in British Columbia that is using cattle to create a type of fire guard around cities such as Kelowna, removing some of the dead grass and some of that kindling that allows a lot of these wildfires to move around. So using cattle to get rid of a lot of that. And then we also released our third short documentary just back in the spring here called Reduce, Reuse, Ruminate. And this is giving the feedlot guys some of the spotlight and indicating how we can take ugly fruits and vegetables and foods that humans either can't eat or won't eat. So other things like damaged crops, maybe it was because of hail, because of pests, and it can't go into the human food chain. We can feed that to animals and we can divert that from feedlot or from landfills. So if we're diverting some of these foods from landfills, then we're reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that would be produced within that decomposition of some of those foods. And then we have another one coming up shortly, and it's going to focus on the wildlife aspect of cattle sharing that ecosystem along wildlife and allowing them to create some of the ideal habitats that wildlife need for reproductive and for critical feeding functions.
Well, I love how all of these kind of dive into specific areas. Like you said, like the reduce, reuse, ruminate. I found it super fascinating because you guys focused in on Feedlot Alley and some of the things that feedlots are doing, which also happens to be one of the biggest potato production areas. And how do we deal with all the potato waste? Well, let's feed it to the cows. And I think that's super fascinating because if you're in the industry, you're likely aware of this, but there's so many different things going on that it is just such a great way to get it out to people.
Yeah, exactly. And, a lot of this isn't new. It's things that producers have been doing forever. But now we can show it and we're like, this is, part of environmental sustainability. And we're kind of just being able to put a light on the things that beef farmers and ranchers have been doing forever.
Where can producers find these documentaries if they haven't had the chance to watch them yet?
We have a YouTube channel called Raising Canadian Beef, and we have all of our short documentaries uploaded there. And we also upload other resources as we develop them as well on that channel.
Awesome. And I know another thing that has kind of come from the Guardians of the Grasslands documentary is there's now a bit of a game for different ages, but I know we showcased it this year at the Calgary Stampede. It was a huge hit. Lots of people loved it. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that game?
Yeah, we're really proud of this game. It was a labor of love and a lot of work was put into it. So it's a spin-off from our documentary, and we saw that there was a bit of a gap of classroom resources in terms of beef production. So we created a game where you have your own herd of cattle, you have different paddocks, and you're moving your cattle around, rotational grazing, and as you do so in a good way, you're collecting carbon points, so that's signifying your sequestering of carbon into the soil. And then you also collect wildlife species as they want to move onto your land. So some of the wildlife species can live alongside cattle, some you want to give a little bit of space to. And we created a version for every province. So every province has their own wildlife that you would see in your specific province. And then we also have it curriculum linked to each province as well. So it creates it. It's a lot easier for teachers to use in their classrooms when we've already all have that curriculum linked. We also do, as you mentioned, we have a trade show version of the game. So it's a little bit shorter and there's less trivia. The plan of the game, you would watch the Guardians of the Grasslands documentary beforehand, and then you would play the game. And as you move your cattle, some trivia questions will come up and you need to answer it in order to move your cattle where you want them to go. So we have a shorter version as well with the trade show that doesn't have the trivia, And then we also have an interactive booth available too. So it draws a lot more kids in, and it's quite interactive and it's quite fun for kids too.
And why do you think it's important, as we address all sorts of social issues and labor management and going back to the research and the consumer study you guys have worked on, why is it so important that we are talking to the kids as well and not forgetting about them in this equation, especially in, I look at something like Aggie Days or Calgary
Mhm.
Stampede, where you're getting a lot of urban audiences coming in that may not be familiar with agriculture.
Yeah, and I mean that's kind of exactly it, is a lot of these kids, if they're not, in these rural areas, they're just not exposed to it. And it is their formative years, and it's really important to kind of teach them from the start, what goes into producing your food, and the steak or your burger that you see on your plate, there's a lot of hard work behind that. And then there's also that side of environmental benefits that is likely not talking about. It's really an underrated, underestimated piece of that environmental puzzle. So if we can get it, to as many people as we can at all ages, it'll make a really big difference.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up here, do you want to talk a bit about Beef Advocacy Canada?
Sure. So the PSE program, we're looking to build strategic communication plan to share key messages about the benefits of cattle production in Canada. And this really includes our grassroots advocacy platform, which is called Beef Advocacy Canada. And it offers training. It's a self-guided program that you can go through at your own pace. And it includes a lot of these resources and a lot of these messaging, including some of the things from the National Beef Sustainability Assessment. So it's a free program, and we're just in the midst of updating it right now. So in fall of this year, we're going to have a brand new shiny platform for people to go through. And once you become a graduate as well, we'll send you free resources, and we'll keep you updated on some of the things that come out in the Canadian beef industry as well.
Amazing. Okay, anything else you'd like to add about your consumer research or as well PSE in general or what you guys are up to?
I think for PSC, just keep an eye out for our new documentary that should be coming in 2025. And just feel free to share all those resources. And if you're in need or you think that the game would work really well for one of your events, just feel free to reach out to us. And we've been sending out tablets across the country to different events. So we're always happy to share any of our resources.
Amazing. Okay, thank you very much for your time, Jenna.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm probably starting to sound like a broken record here, but I really do love that push that we need to look at sustainability as a three-legged stool. The stool will not stand without all three legs. Very interesting stuff there. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of The Bovine. If you have any questions about any of the episodes you've listened to, or maybe you have a suggestion for another episode, don't hesitate to send me an email at kara.m@albertabeef.org, and please use the hashtag ABPsTheBovine on your social media channels. It's great to see and hear your thoughts. Anyways, appreciate you all. Good luck, be safe, and we'll talk to you next time.